Welcome, everyone. I'm Quinn Teskey, and the Director of DEIB here at Consciously Unbiased. We are an organization whose mission is to create more inclusive workplaces. So some of you may have already been to one of our LinkedIn Live events before. So welcome back if you've joined us before. And for newcomers, we're excited to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about figures in the DEIB space and the different dynamics from all over the world and how DEIB shows up. We've got some great perspectives, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to meet all of our panelists here in just a second. Just also wanted to always give everybody a pre-warning. There are times where certain content or topics that we bring up may be sensitive to certain communities or certain global communities, so just be wary of that. But we really want to try to shine a light on and speak towards how we can make an impact. So this is all in the spirit of positivity, but we are excited about our panelists today. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start off with having each of you just share who you are and what your connections are to the DEIB space, and then where are you based out of in the world. So let's start with Haley.
Thanks. Somehow I knew I was going to be first. It's really good to be here and lovely to have so many of you listening in. My name is Haley Baker. I'm the co-founder of Diversely, which is a DE&I software business that was recently acquired by the Access Group. I think I come generally from traditionally kind of male-dominated areas of business, so financial services, IT, and I've always been the person organizing communities of women. You know, on the side, I headed nonprofit Girls in Tech. I was in the board. And I think that's really where that passion for DEIB came from. I just thought, why should I start with women? A lot of challenges and barriers are faced by all. And that's why I was able to combine kind of my professional and my nonprofit passions into one, which is Diversely. And I'm based out of Abu Dhabi.
Wonderful. We're so glad to have you, Haley, and you are doing some really, really amazing work. We're looking forward to hearing more about that. Let's go with Sharon next.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm Shiran. I'm the CEO and founder of Informed Decisions Interview Intelligence, and I'm based in Israel. I'm an organizational psychologist, and basically have dedicated my career to increasing the accuracy and fairness of people's decisions in the workplace, with a specific expertise or emphasis on hiring practices. So I've done it as a consultant for many years, and then approximately 8 years ago, went into the technology world. So Informed Decisions is the second HR tech startup that I've founded that is dedicated to the very same mission. And what we're doing at Informed Decisions is we're focusing on interviewers as the most important interview tool that also has the most bias. And we're aiming to improve interviewers by providing them actionable feedback, both on the things that they're doing well and their biases. So that's me.
I love that. I love that we're going to have some great technology-based conversations today as well with all of you, because that is definitely a huge growing area. All right, let's go with Dia next, and then Anna.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Dia, and I'm based in Seattle. I'm originally from Canada, born in Singapore, have lived in quite a few places around the world. I am a DEI consultant for my organization, Global Idea. My focus is on cultural intelligence and cultural humility, as well as how to disrupt biases and microaggressions. And my background is a little bit different in journalism and in education. And then I moved into technology as well. So very excited to be here with the rest of you and participate in this conversation.
Awesome. We're so glad to have you. And finally, Anna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna, and I work for Jaguar Land Rover, a part of our corporate function. So I really focus on our global strategy and all that entails. in all of the 25 countries that we operate in. As a corporate function, I would say my connection to the DEI space is I came out at a young age in a environment that was not really equipped to support me. And so through kind of going through my own experience, kind of came to this realization that my life should be all about helping others have the opportunity to not feel what I felt in those spaces. And so that kind of got me started in the HR space and employee relations, which then started to do DEI work for Portland Trailblazers, the NBA, and then brought that to JLR, where we were really focusing so much of our DEI work in the UK, where our corporate headquarters are based, but 20% of our workforce is out of the UK. So, and we couldn't do what we were doing in the UK everywhere else, as I think we'll talk about in a bit. But just really excited to be here and get to talk about doing this, although challenging, really important work around the globe.
Awesome. Excited. I bet you have some really good stories from the Portland Trailblazers. We'll have to talk about that another time. All right. So we are going to start with the topic of self-identification. Can you all share some different ways that we are thinking about self-identification across the globe? How would you identify yourself outside of a box or a checkbox that you're given in a few words?
I'm happy to kick us off. It's interesting. When I moved to the US, one of the options I was given as a way to identify was Asian. I am from the Asian continent, or you can say my family is, but I struggled with that box. I struggled with it because I've never really referred to myself as Asian. I've referred to myself as a Canadian with family with roots in India. And even then, my family never really lived in India. So there was a lot more complexity to those questions than what allowed me to answer through the boxes that were offered to me. I love the practice of self-identification. I think that's where we can bring in different pieces of ourselves. And interestingly, your identities shift depending on where you are at the moment. So right now, being in the US, I may refer to one part of my identity differently than I would if I were somewhere else at that point in my life. It's just something that's more organic and more fluid than how we may be presented with those options. I'd love to hear from the rest of you as to whether you also struggle a little bit with the single checkbox options that are given to us.
I mean, I'm happy to continue from there because I 100% relate to what you're saying, Dia. Like, I was born in South Africa to French ancestors on my mother's side, Dutch on my father's side. I feel like I grew up in the Netherlands and I have a Dutch passport, but then I lived in Santiago, Chile, Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam. So whenever someone asks me, where are you from? I almost like stammer, like, where am I from? Or what is your background? And I often say that I am Dutch from origin. And if I have to self-identify, I guess I'm white Caucasian. But it feels like a very loaded question. I'm like, it depends. How do I even answer that? And it's something that came up a lot in the work that I was doing with diversity is how can we make the options as broad and diverse as possible? Because asking someone in Singapore if they're white, Black, African, or Asian doesn't really give you the insights that you're looking for, right? So 100% relate.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with both that it's definitely challenging, especially as we, look to try to change people's experiences throughout the globe, based on who they are and how they identify. We tried to adapt a UK demographic survey for the US, and we all speak English, and that took months because, we all identify so different based on, not only where we're at in our current life, but where we're sitting, where how we've grown up, the terms that we use, as Dia said. So I definitely love the self-identifying bit, but also brings its own challenges as you're trying to change in a positive way those experiences for the people that are facing things that we don't want them to, that we want, we want to change those experiences to be more positive. So a challenging one for sure, but so important to just recognize that we're all identifying different across the globe.
Absolutely. And there's so many different legal nuances and challenges that you really have to think about when it comes to data collection and privacy. And so just for those of you that are in global roles or thinking about implementing a self-ID strategy, you really need to make sure that you're looking at, how your employees are distributed across the globe, and making sure you're consulting with legal and your HR partners to make sure you're doing that in a safe way, but also in an inclusive way. So thank you all for that. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about just some general best practices. So we're kind of going to start a little broad. What are some of those best practices that you all have found or have seen be successful when working with companies or in any of your previous roles or current roles when addressing global DEI?
Yeah, I can get us kicked off. I think for me, the biggest thing, and to kind of simplify it, is really to just be bringing your employees along on the journey with you. I think, we focus on, do we focus on recruitment or do we focus on inclusion, and what comes first? Because you want to make sure that people have the right experiences once they're brought into the organization. But you also have to bring your employees along with you and meet them where they're at. And I think that's why this global conversation is so important, because we're meeting our employees in South Korea in a very different place than we're meeting them in Slovakia, than we're meeting them in the US. And so, we can talk about policies and practices and procedures and all those things that we end up wanting to change for the better, and, ERGs and BRGs. But I think for me, the thing I found as the most important is really connecting with those managing directors and HR directors in the local countries, and getting a true baseline understanding of where are you at? Have you done anything in the DEI space and, locally? If not, that's okay. That's totally fine. Let's just understand where you are. What are the themes that you are hearing? The themes in the US and are very different than what's coming up, around the rest of the globe. So again, you can't adapt what you're doing everywhere else. So just meeting your people where they are, getting a true understanding of what they're facing, and then kind of building a plan from there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna.
I'd be happy to chime in. So from my perspective, helping organizations build more inclusive hiring practices, then there is a tension between standardization and customization, because on the one hand, we want to level the playing field for everyone and create a fair experience. And eventually, when we're hiring for a sales position or an analyst position, there are specific overarching skills that we want to look at. And in that sense, standardizing your process and asking everyone the same set of questions, applying the same scoring rubrics, etc., that has a lot of years of research showing that it works, that it's more that it's just like more of a fair practice, that it reduces a significant amount of bias. But then are all of the questions that we're asking relevant and will be interpreted the same and will create a positive experience all across the globe? The answer for that is no. We really need to be thoughtful about the questions that we're asking and how we're adapting those questions to different cultures. So just as one example, so if we want to hire someone that is high on independence and at a Western culture, we might ask a question about a project that you led yourself, or a project that you were very independent working on. In other cultures, in more collective cultures, that might be interpreted in a negative way, like being independent, working outside of a team, not within a collaboration. So we might want to look at independence, but we would want to assess it in different ways and be sensitive to those intricacies. And that's why my best practice is standardize and customize. Find a balance between the two.
Oh, that's such great advice and so true. I never really thought about that, but when you're standardizing the interview process and you kind of are coming up with these sort of, standard questions, like really thinking about how those are going to land, depending on your audience, and probably also like who is part of the interview process is also something to consider. Does anybody else have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I'm allowed to, I 100% agree with both of you. When you mentioned the question, I wrote down two things, balancing global versus local and standard versus customization. So very much resonate. I think in the space that I've been working on is in recruitment. So really at the beginning of the hiring process, and part of that is self-identification. So I think part of it is, yes, understanding the local rules and regulations and consulting them, but it's also understanding local cultural nuances and words that are used. So one great example that I've come across living in the Middle East and in Abu Dhabi, for example, if you were to ask someone, do you have a disability or do you identify as having any of these disabilities? They'll say, what do you mean? You're supposed to say, are you a person of determination? So even coming with the same question might be misunderstood in that kind of a setting. So I think setting kind of high-level guidelines as we want to track as much as we're allowed to and able to in your jurisdiction. You can come up with the questions that are not only legal, but also framed relevantly that they will be understood is a great way of doing it. And I think that's what we do with everything. So we want to widen talent funnels. We want people to reach out to at least 5 different job boards to attract different talent. Which job boards those are, that is local to your country, obviously. So I think there are certain standards that you can set that are applicable, but then can be filled in at a local level.
Such a good point. Thank you, Haley.
I would just quickly add as a best practice, so thank you everybody for mentioning the importance of thinking through that global lens, global and then local, having those local ambassadors and touch points on the ground that you can ask questions to and challenge ideas against. There's a wonderful tool that I use called Globe Smart. Some of you may be familiar with it, but you can invite people within your organization to develop their own Globe Smart profile. And what it does is it looks at about 5 to 10 different areas to see whether you're more independent or interdependent, more direct, more indirect. And then it also looks at where the organization is, and you end up with 3 different comparative points. And what it's interesting to see that an organization itself may lean, for example, more direct if they're from the US or the UK or other parts of the world, but your employees may not necessarily be at that level of directness. And so just getting a gauge and an understanding of, as originally said, from all of you, where people are rather than where you want them to be. So that would be my best practice.
Oh, that's a good one. I've never heard of Globe Smart, but it sounds really cool. I'm going to check it out as soon as this is over. So thank you all. That was great. Okay, so you mentioned something, Dia, that I want to kind of pivot into is some of the, I guess, like challenges or maybe even, mistakes that sometimes companies make is, really looking through the lens of where they're headquartered and that kind of being the dominant lens of how you, roll things out or, how you, put forward a strategy. How can companies do some things differently so that they're avoiding, because I know what it feels like, to be in that position where you've got different regions saying, well, why is it always like this way? Because it's coming from the US, or maybe it's coming from, some other place where the company may be headquartered. And so how can companies avoid that or kind of mitigate that as a backlash sometimes that they can feel where their employees are distributed all over the world?
I would say that one way is by understanding that we're not at fault for having that default mindset. It is the water that we swim in. And it's important to intentionally challenge ourselves to step out of that default. Wherever you are, if that culture or that location is the dominant, chances are those practices are going to seep into the day-to-day cultural practices of the organization. I always find it helpful to have a reminder, whether it's in the organizational mission or our values, to list out that we want to intentionally challenge those dominant ways of thinking. Not being from the US, but living in the US, it often shows up in simple ways, such as the language that we use, such as the references we make, even the time zones that we offer to others. As somebody who is from Canada, even just the metric system versus the imperial system, you'd be surprised. Even something as simple as how we list out dates. Is it month, day, year? Is it day, month, year? It varies from place to place. So being aware of where we are and whether that is the dominant and how those practices seep into other ways of thinking is incredibly important to being able to challenge that dominant way.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that. Anybody else have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm still constantly confused by the way that dates show up from my colleagues in the UK. And it is just a good reminder, for me as well all the time that, again, we're just simplest things can be so different around the globe. And I think just like Dia said as well, where, you have the most amount of people, that is just going to seep into everything else. And so for us, I feel like, when I really started doing this work at JLR, we had done such a great job in the UK, and really that gave us kind of a jumping point, right? We were only doing it in the UK, but that did allow us to start somewhere. And then we kind of decided, well, if we're doing inclusion work, we should probably do it around the globe as well, not just in our, one space. But yeah, it is starting to think about the communications that get sent out. What is the language that we're using? What is the timing that we're sending that? Is that landing in people's inbox when they're sleeping? And it's really important, small things like that you can start to shift to really create the culture change, I think is really important.
Fantastic. All right. So we did mention a little bit about legalities earlier. So I would love to dive in a little bit more. And this might even kind of bleed into some of the technical work that you all are doing as well, because I know that you have to navigate that very carefully. How do you walk the fine line of what is legal, but still wanting to be bold and work towards change? We know that there are certain parts of the world that, certain things may not be acceptable yet or legal or culturally just not the norm. So how do you balance that? What's legal and culturally appropriate by still pushing the boundary a little bit, getting people to evolve, getting the organization to evolve in that area? I know that's a tricky one.
So many of us unmuted. I can go first and then
Okay, go ahead,
and then somebody else. Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one. And for me, again, this was, this is where we kind of partnered with, we partnered with a company called EY, Ernst & Young, and really did these dive-in workshops with all of our countries that we exist in, because we wanted to do a type of behavioral-based training that actually we could measure the success of versus just a typical, click through, something that people saw themselves in and that were based off of stories within our organization. But ultimately that led us to, 7 main stories on our storyboard that we had, that we then had to kind of dive through with the legal team to understand, can we have this story in this country or can we not, because of legal challenges? And then we also faced, pushback from some HR business partners in those spaces as well as to what was comfortable versus uncomfortable. And those are 2 different things. And we said from the beginning of this training that we were building that we want to be bold in the spaces that we can be bold. And then we don't want to cross the line when it comes to those legalities, right? So I have a perfect example of we have an LGBTQ story, and the ask from the legal team was to remove that for Dubai. And we said, okay, we understand because of the legalities, but actually what's the pushback there? What would actually happen if we kept this in? Because again, we want to be bold where we can. Well, turns out that actually has legal implications for the people who put out the training. And so once we heard that, we said, absolutely not. We won't do that. We won't put our people in that situation. We'll be removing that story from Dubai. But we also heard back from Japan, in which neurodiversity was really uncomfortable and they didn't necessarily want to talk about it because we have a story that surrounds that. And so we went to our legal team again and said, tell us, is this something that's illegal or is this something that's just uncomfortable? And they came back and said, there's absolutely no problem with having this in the story. It's just an uncomfortable thing to talk about. And so that's where we then, had the conversation with the HR business partners in that country and talked about, we understand this is comfortable. Let's provide some support around this because we want to keep in this bit where we can be bold, where it's not illegal, there's no repercussions on anyone, and can provide a perfect area of opportunity to just learn more. So providing the support in those places that we're being bold, but also having the knowledge to know why we're not doing something somewhere. And that doesn't mean you can't still do DEI work. It's just changing the focus.
Oh, such great examples, and another example of how you're standardizing by every region is going to get some kind of learning and development exposure, but what they get and what kind of form it shows up in and the stories that you tell are going to be customized to really meet that audience.
Exactly.
So it's such a great example of that. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that, of course, the quantitative approach really resonates with me. So Anna started by saying we wanted something more measurable that we can actually track and see the results. And I think in that terms, there are many opportunities to being more bold within the legal limitations. So I think an act of boldness is just facing up to reality and admitting what's not working. Of course, also acknowledging what's working, but the ability to do that, the ability to know which of your initiatives are working or not working, that requires measurement. And by measuring the impact and the results of your different DEI initiatives, then you can hold leaders accountable with data. So just to give a concrete example of some of the stuff that we're doing, so you don't need to define diversity quotas in order to tell that you're hiring or promoting more male, for example, more males versus females, right? It's in the data. If you look into the data, if you analyze the data, if you present the data, you can have meaningful discussions around those areas. And in many times, what we see that when we show the data, many times in many forward-thinking organizations that actually are implementing our platform because they want to do better, and they acknowledge the importance that it's unintentional, right? It's a lot of times it's just unconscious bias. So just measuring, putting the numbers out there, having meaningful discussions, and iterating based on the data. That's in my mind already being bold.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Things are being able to measure impact has become so much more prevalent now that we have more data. We've got more tech solutions that give us those insights and the ability to look at those types of things. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Does anybody have anything else they want to add on this topic? And I'm going to jump into the tech space a little bit because I know we've got the data is very relevant to that space as well. So. All right. So to that point, tell us a little bit. I would love to, again, hear from you, Haley, hear from you, Sharon, and really all of you, because you all have varying experiences with different types of technology in order to really, create that global strategy and support that strategy. So tell us more about what's happening in the tech space as it relates to DEI. How are your companies making an impact? What are some of the different, experiences that you've recognized as you're building out your product and designing the approach that your technology is designed for?
That one off. So with diversity, I would say we started about 5 years ago. And the main reason why my co-founder, Helen, and I decided to move to a tech solution is that we were slightly frustrated, to be honest. We were frustrated with the impact and the scale that we could have by doing consulting, by running events, by doing webinars, not taking away from any of the value that that has, but we said there must be a way to structurally change how people work, which is a lot of the times what we want to do is how organizations recruit, how they hire, how they engage with their employees. And that's really neither of us necessarily set out to build a tech company, but it was actually the only way we could deliver on some of the design principles that we had. And I think we had a number of principles. One of them was we needed to be measurable. So I love that everyone has brought that up. We're like, if you can't measure it, in our previous work, the first thing that happened was, oh, this has all been so great, clap, clap, clap. And then as soon as there's any downturn in business, all budget is removed. But we couldn't prove any business case because we had no metrics. We had positive feel, we had gut feel. We're like, we cannot build something that structurally changes anything if we don't have business proof points in data. So that had to be the number one. The second thing we wanted to do is we wanted to make an impact beyond just gender. So we wanted something that could tackle bias. And a lot of the barriers faced are beyond gender and are quite similar. So having tackle one helped all. So we didn't have to run events and training about gender or about sexual orientation. We could tackle them all in one place. Another principle that we had was making it globally relevant and compliant. So that was a huge talent from a tech perspective, because whenever you're building tech, to some extent, you're standardizing, right? Whether that's processes, whether that's legal frameworks, they're going to be built in, which is great because it automatically keeps people on, the straight path, but that path has to be different for every region that you're in. And we started off in Singapore, pretty soon moved up to the UK, started serving US customers. So every time one of our customers moved into a different market, we had to deep dive into all that regulation and translate that into, so how do we almost like hard code that into our product? So you can't be asking for data that you're not allowed to have, that we process that data in ways that are compliant and secure, but that we ask things that are culturally relevant, for example. So tech has been a great gift, but it has also brought with it many challenges. I think back in the day when we were fundraising, what we heard a lot is also, what is DEI tech? Like, what is tech about that? Why don't you? So you're a consultant? Are you a trainer? What do you do? We're like, no, we're a technology that solves for DEI. So I think in the early days, this just wasn't a category. A lot of times when we started partnering with people, we created new categories like marketplaces, which was awesome because when we came, these businesses found other DEI tech solutions that were in similar spaces, adjacent, that were complementary. And by being the first, we felt like we were creating space for all these other awesome solutions that were popping up, and we were no longer alone. And something that we heard from a lot of investors is, oh, but there's so many of you now. I'm like, actually, they're not enough because there's just so many challenges to be solved. The more, the better. We love our competitors.
Yes. And there is never in almost any industry, there's never a one-stop shop that fixes everything. I think it's always going to be a collaboration, across the board, especially within the DEIB space. There's all these different levers that you can pull at different times, and you have to kind of have your switchboard out and be looking at that at all times. And so like a dashboard or something that gives you the data, but then what lever to pull, which might be a different platform or a different tool or a different best practice. And keeping your eyes on that is a lot of work. And it requires a lot of global leader engagement as well, and buy-in. To your point, Haley, if you don't have the business case or the results, it's going to be hard to get that funding renewed for that project, or it's going to be hard to sell your executive team that we need to go invest in something if you don't have that ability to show metrics and data. So Sharon, can you tell us a little bit about how you're utilizing technology to help mitigate bias?
Yes, definitely. So my starting point was very similar to Haley's, in a sense that I worked in this domain as a consultant for many years, and I felt the need to scale. And another frustration that I've experienced is that I've worked very closely with many organizations to build really top-notch, sophisticated hiring practices based on a lot of science, but eventually, like when it got to the usability of actual interviewers using it, what we saw is that you can have the most prestigious or fancy tools. Eventually, if interviewers are working out of their own biases, then it wouldn't change. It wouldn't change neither the accuracy or the fairness of your process. So that's where the shift or the focus came to say, okay, what we should be optimizing for is interviewers' behaviors, interviewers' practices, and what we're doing with data that the interviewers are inputting into our platform as they interview. If it's the scores that they're giving, their documentation, the interview transcription, is to provide them with very concrete, individualized feedback about the things that they're doing well, their strengths and their biases. So I'll just give an example to kind of for you to get the feel of it. So one common bias that we're seeing is time of day bias. So we're seeing that candidates that are being interviewed in the afternoons versus in the mornings are getting significant lower scores. Okay, so when we show that to an interviewer, then it's not just about raising their awareness. First of all, like usually they don't have a clue that they're doing that, but it's also about, okay, what can you do differently next time? So of course we wouldn't tell you don't interview in the afternoon because it's not practical, right? But we can tell you, okay, since you're more cognitively diluted in the afternoon, take a 5 minutes break, take a little bit longer to prepare, drink coffee, small stuff that can create a behavioral change. Or we can show you that you're assessing male candidates on cognitive skills higher and women on interpersonal skills higher. We're actually seeing those stereotypes being perpetuated in the data. And then again, okay, I have that stereotype. I'm not doing it intentionally. It's just what's happening. Now, how do I do it differently? So by providing the different tools of scoring rubrics, and the interview summaries that we're generating and all these types of stuff, it's moving from awareness to behavioral change with the data and also with behavioral nudging. So if we're showing you how you're doing compared to your team, if we're giving you badges every time you make a progress or eliminate some kind of a bias, then it kind of incentivizes you to become better. You want to beat the bias. Like now you're in a competition with your biases and how do I get better? And that's kind of how we use data, gamification, behavioral nudging in order to reduce the bias.
I love that. And it doesn't matter what age you are, gamification is always amazing. Everyone, no matter where you're from, loves getting recognition or getting that little coin or that points or rewards or badges. All of that is great. I love how you've integrated that into it as well as that reinforcement. So thank you for sharing. Dia or Anna, any additional thoughts in the tech space?
I would say one area that I've found pretty interesting recently is how technology is looking at how meetings are run. There's some very interesting AI platforms out there right now that are doing an analysis after a meeting to say, maybe this person has spoken this percentage of time and this person has not. And as somebody who comes from a culture of it's not necessarily considered to be socially acceptable to be the first and only one to speak. It's actually helped me give the case that part of the meeting structure should be to lean out so others can lean in versus just waiting for the loudest person in the room to speak. That is very often rooted in a Western notion of the person who speaks the most and the person who speaks the loudest is perceived as the natural leader. That's not necessarily the case around the world. We know culturally, and a lot of the other panelists may be able to relate to this, sometimes a leader is the one that is gives the grace of others speaking first. So I'm just finding that interesting. It is a bit of a balancing act. We don't, you both already mentioned this so wonderfully, that we don't want tech to replace the critical thinking that DEI consultants come in and offer. We rather want it to be a tool that aids us in being able to show how things are done and how we can propel it and accelerate it forward, but not to replace what we all come in and offer from that context.
Absolutely. That's such a great point. It's interesting you said that, because one of the best practices that we provide when we're doing inclusive leadership training is in a meeting, as the leader, reserving your thoughts and opinions last, so that you give everyone an opportunity to speak up. What if someone disagrees with you and you kick off the meeting with how you think about how something should be done? Do you think that that's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to speak up and disagree with you in front of everyone? Probably not. So as a leader, that's such a great point, Dia, is leaning out. I like that term, and allowing space for other people to share ideas. You're going to get a lot more innovation, collaboration, and probably a much more productive meeting, to your point, overall. And really cool tech, it sounds like. So another one I want to go check out. So just the rise of AI, ChatGPT, all this stuff, technology is just amazing to me. I just can't believe it. So Haley, do you have something?
Yes. On that topic, wondering if any of you have read that Bloomberg article or research that came out about the use of ChatGPT to actually rank applicants or candidates for a role and the level of bias that was built in. I think the outcome was, for those that didn't see it, that Asian women automatically, all else being the same, get ranked higher, and Black men the lowest. And this is purely based on the bias that sits in GPT. And I think I wrote an article about that because, and you alluded to this, Dia, I think we have to be really thoughtful about where we implement tech, and especially AI, and always maintain that level of human critical thought and control at the end of the day. See it as an enablement tool, not something that takes over any of our decision making. I think that's also one of the guiding principles of ethical AI that we've always built in, is like, AI doesn't make any decisions. It helps us get more and better information to make the decisions ourselves. So yeah, love that point.
If you're a recruiter, make sure you read that article. It's a Bloomberg article. And yes, it was very eye-opening, because I do think that we're always looking for ways to do things better, and tech enables us to do things faster, more efficiently, gather better data. But to your point, we cannot let that replace, because then we're only perpetuating the bias. As that article showed, there's bias built in sometimes to the technology, and we need to be on the lookout for that. So awesome. All right. So I'm going to move on to a little bit more of a heavier topic, as we've all probably experienced around the globe at different points in time. But there seems to be a lot of anti-DEI talk right now, and backlash in different parts of the world, in different communities. How are we addressing that? What guidance can we give to our colleagues out there that are fighting the good fight with us on how to weather this storm, and what are the different kind of narratives that are out there around anti-DEI, anti-woke, all these different terms that we're hearing?
I think it's interesting that I would say different countries and different regions are in different parts of their journey. Whereas we may be seeing some anti-DEI backlash in the US, there are other countries and regions that are actually accelerating in this area. And so keeping that lens on, that we can always look to those other regions that are doing well and accelerating these conversations to say, look, this is the outcome if we continue the path. We're going to go through these ebbs and flows. Right now, we are going through a bit of an ebb. And also continuing to develop this community where, as a single person in this space, I don't have all the answers. But being in community with others, I can reach out and say, hey, what are some data points, some studies, what are you hearing from other parts of the world and the work that they're doing that I can have in my pocket and have close to me so that I can continue to make the case when necessary. This is the nature of the business. And I do think that if we are committed to what we know are the outcomes of DEI and staying committed on the long-term path, I think that's going to help our case long-term.
Absolutely. Anna, I'd love to hear from you on this, and I'd love to hear from everyone on this one, because this is an important topic, and it's probably weighing on a lot of people's minds. Is like, hey, how do we stick together and weather the storm, and figure out how to address these types of issues? So, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Dia said. I think it's really important to recognize that, we may be hearing this a lot in the US, but then, in the UK, our CEO keeps saying we're doubling down on DEI. And so really putting into context where we're hearing that, helps us understand kind of what's going on. But also I think, and sometimes it feels silly to stick to, what is often called the business case, right? But we do know that when, we have more diverse teams, they outperform, their peers. We know all of these really simple things that I think if we just stick to, really helps with that conversation. I also think that whether it's called DEI or something else, what we're actually talking about is how to behave with one another, respect one another, embrace each other's differences. And that's never going away. So, again, whether it's called DEI or something different, there's always going to be work to do within, those values and behaviors that we want to see in the world and within our organizations.
Oh, such a good point.
I agree so much with both of you. And that's because I agree. If it's not a big theme in one country, that can still continue on in others. That's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing APAC come up way more. US leadership. We sent out a campaign the other day, and I got an email back saying, "We do not hire with racist DEI. We hire for merit." And that's clearly, in my view, just a lack of understanding of what we're actually trying to do here. So there's just a lot of work to do in terms of that awareness and education, and that it isn't all about positive action. It's actually about leveling playing fields. It's removing barriers, and we just have to accept that not everyone at all times will be on that boat, as long as we keep momentum up in different areas of the business. And we reached out to this person, tried to have a civil conversation. They weren't open to it, but that's also fine. We won't convince everyone, is our view. There will always be enough people who are in for understanding what we do.
Such a good point. I'd love to hear more on that as well. And I want to hear from Sharon, but these myths that are out there, I think sometimes misunderstandings of what DEI and B work really is, inclusion really means. So I'd love to unpack that too, if anybody has any thoughts. But let's hear from Sharon first on this topic.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Anna. I don't think that it matters that much. How do you frame it? If eventually you're getting to the same goal, so if you need to frame it a little bit, just in a slightly different way or in a different terminology, eventually you're still working towards the same goal. So I would say that from my perspective, if like prospects are now reaching out to us more around, okay, I want to hire merit-based, like Haley said, like the most qualified candidates, and like 6 months ago or a year ago, it was more about increasing diversity. The infrastructure remains the same. Like you standardize, you score, you provide a data-driven infrastructure for decision making, whether it's in hiring or whether it's promotion or internal mobility. Eventually, that infrastructure serves multiple goals. So if a different goal terminology has to be highlighted, but eventually we're getting there, and when this entire buzz thing will calm down a little bit, and we can return to using the same terminology, then I think it's a small sacrifice to make. We're in it for the impact and for the long run. So you remember standardization, customization. I think it also applies here.
Oh, such a good point. Yes. We've even seen with some of our conversations lately is, hey, can we change the title of this from psychological safety to something else? Like even just small little changes. And it's like, sure, trust and openness. Those are great. That means the same thing. It's, so I love that point. It really matters about the impact and moving forward in that direction. And if we have to make some small adjustments along the way to the language that we're using, whatever works, right? Whatever we can do to get people thinking the right way and behaving, to Anna's point, like in the way that we're wanting them to behave respectfully and engage with one another in a way that is inclusive across the globe, and inclusive of all types of people, which is the point. So wonderful. Any other thoughts on this one? Any other? This is a great opportunity to myth bust. If you feel like you've heard, some other examples like Haley shared, where people have a misconception of what the work that we all are doing. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think if I may, I have one more. Our slogan at some point was hire the best, not the most obvious. And that's because we pivoted away from the diversity and inclusion recruitment and for me, it's doing exactly the same things. And I think when you say that your recruitment solution is for DE&I, I think you're identifying and pinpointing underrepresented people and pushing them, whether they're qualified or not, through the funnel into their organization. But what you're actually doing is helping them identify untapped talent that they haven't seen before, taking them through a much more open funnel that does not have unnecessary criteria that actually don't lead to successful outcomes for their business, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the myth that we work through every day, is saying actually hiring for merit and hiring for DEI are exactly the same thing. We're not pushing unqualified candidates down your throat. We're widening your talent funnel. We're helping you see what truly is the best talent, not just a replica of all the talent that you've already recruited in the past.
Right. Or a replica of yourself. Sometimes we know that shows up. People are always looking for things that they can relate to, but that doesn't always make for the best team. You don't want a team of people that are just like you. You're probably not going to get as far. You're probably not going to have as much innovation and opportunity. So great point there. Anybody else? So while we close out on this topic.
Haley, I just wanted to say I appreciate that. My mom is a microbiologist by background, and she became a teacher, and she got a position as the head of science. So well-deserved, but she was called out as a diversity hire, or somebody who got it because she was underrepresented and a minority. And it really took the fire out of that, just the celebration out of that. And despite having all the credentials and done all the work, just being labeled that was a painful time in her career, and redirecting the conversation to, you want the best, we also want the best. So we're not propelling people into these positions because they're underrepresented. We're actually removing barriers so underrepresented people can have the opportunity to showcase their excellence. I love just the way you frame that. So thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, we got just a few more things. I would love to hear from you all around social media marketing, global representation, like when we're thinking about what we see when we go to our favorite brands and we go shop, or we engage with a product or a company through those different ways. So what are some different ways that we can ensure that we continue to increase that representation, and from a global perspective, including like what we celebrate and how we celebrate it in corporate America, for example, or global corporations. I think that was something I always struggled with, being from the US, looking at, well, let's just not think about all the different holidays that the US has, or the different important dates and cultural celebrations that we need to consider, and really just trying to make sure we pleased everyone and we considered every community. But we know that's incredibly hard to do. So what are some thoughts on that whole global representation, social media, celebrations? How do we do all of that as a global leader and make sure that everyone's included?
I'd love to share a tool. About 3 years ago, I created a global diversity calendar, and the catalyst behind it was being from Toronto and having family that celebrates so many different occasions and observes different holidays. I thought it would be helpful to share with others what and when those occasions took place. As we know, that can influence the products and services that we build and what we offer. Right now, we're in the month of March. Obviously, we had International Women's Day, International Women's Month, all kinds of things. But also, there's a lot of people celebrating or practicing Ramadan right now, leading up to Eid. As somebody who celebrates Diwali, I didn't always see that recognized in workplaces. It would almost be celebrated behind closed doors. It would be a struggle to say, this is a time that I want to take and be with my family. And only now are we beginning to see those conversations come to the surface. And what I've realized as a global DEI professional is you don't know what you don't know. So it's not to fault anybody. It's just, how do we create and offer these tools? And when those tools are offered, we don't just want the conversation to start and stop with, this is the date, this is the checkbox, now it's done. I've heard a lot of my Black women colleagues say that they are approached in February, which in the US is Black History Month. We know in October it's elsewhere in the UK and Ireland and other places. But then in March, a lot of those conversations stop. And to me, I'm saying, well, if it's International Women's Month, why do those conversations stop in March? So I'm not here to say, let's just celebrate through a checkbox, but rather let's have these tools and use these tools so that we can create the awareness, which allows us to build those products and services more inclusively.
That's wonderful. And we would love to get access to that tool that you've created. If you want to drop it in the chat, or we can make sure we share it with our audience afterwards, Dia, that would be amazing. Would love to take a look at that. So who else would like to share on this topic?
I can share quickly, because I think we have used a similar calendar to kind of get an understanding as a team, what are all the things that are going on around the globe. But also, what are the things that are most important to our people in our organization? And so, we have some really wonderful employee-led business resource groups. And so getting an understanding from them what it is that they want to see celebrated. And obviously, like you said, Quinn, there's no way that we can actually celebrate every single thing every single year, because if we do that, almost every day will be full of something, right? But what are the things that we're prioritizing that are most important to people, that are applicable to everyone across the globe, but also taking into consideration those, locally, those things that need to be celebrated locally. And so this was the first year that we kind of posted our own internal calendar of the gold events that we were going to do. And these are the things that we're going to put all of our resources behind, and not to take away from anything else, but that will have the most impact for the most amount of people across the world. And that's not to say that we will celebrate the same things next year, right? It's an ever evolving thing. And maybe we can put so much focus on these events this year, and then we'll put that much focus on events next year. So it's not to say that any one thing is more important than the other, but listening to what do our people want to see. And if we can't get to all of that this year, we won't, then, how are we building a plan for that to continue throughout the next couple of years? And then lastly, real quick, because you mentioned social media in the beginning, I think one really simple tool that not all of us use enough is just an inclusion lens when we're building something for social media or a policy or making some kind of decision. Just asking ourselves, like, who is in this room that is making this decision or building this policy or whatever it might be, and who isn't? What are those perspectives that we need to get in order to make whatever decision this is as inclusive as possible? And just kind of taking yourself through some really simple questions like that can actually end up bringing a whole lot more perspective than you originally had.
Oh, that's a really good best practice. Thank you for sharing that. Look at who's not in the room, and who you should include in that conversation and decision. We have time for just one more quick thing. This is something that we always like to end with, and we do something at Consciously Unbiased called micro progressions. We want to put a positive spin on the change, and so a micro progression is a small action or step that you can take to create a positive habit towards inclusion. So I would love to know if any of you have any ideas or thoughts on what's one small action, and if you can leave the audience with one thing that they can take walking away from this, what would that be?
Happy to kick this one off. I think I always operate well having little reminders by my desk. So, for instance, I have a post-it that says, what assumption am I making that I might be making because of my identity or experience or background that I should actually like second guess and check? Would person A or B or C from my group of friends who comes from a very different background, would they make the same assumption as I am? Just having that reminder when you're going through your day to day, I think has been really helpful.
Love that.
I'll go next. I just think respectfully asking questions, I think that actually leads off of Haley's point. Don't assume anything, and ask questions in a respectful way, and learn to understand more.
Thank you. Wonderful. Dia or Sharon, any advice for our audience?
I would say practice cultural humility over cultural intelligence. Cultural humility is rooted in understanding that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. And we're not intended to. It's rather just asking questions, being humble, being open to feedback, and just always understanding that things are changing, and being open to where the fluidity is. So cultural humility would be mine.
That's a new one. I like that. I love that. Thank you. And Sharon,
yeah, that's also mine. Like I just thought about be humble. Just acknowledging we don't know everything. How many times have we heard, I can tell if a candidate is a good fit within the first 5 minutes of an interview, right? Acknowledge that you don't know everything, and consider more perspectives. Um, just by being humble, it will make you take actions in the right direction. Consider more perspective, adopting more tools and more processes. So be humble.
I love that. Well, I want to thank you all today for your wonderful perspectives and advice for everyone. I think we learned a ton. Great conversation. And thank you to our audience who joined us today. We hope to see you back again with Consciously Unbiased and our next panel that's coming up in April. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be.
Thank you, everybody. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.